Hi everyone, my name is David Carre and I chose to do my oral presentation on tribal issues in emergency management. So today in the United States there are 562 federally recognized Indian tribes, and the United States recognizes that each of these tribes have a right to self-government and self-determination. The UN Refugee Agency notes that indigenous populations typically inhabit a region before it was invaded or colonized by currently dominant cultures. So the way we've governed these indigenous populations in the United States specifically has changed over the years. Initially, under the Stafford Act, Alaska Native and American Indian tribes were forced to deflect to state governors to request a major disaster declaration from the president. In January of 2013, the Obama administration put the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act into effect. And essentially, these tribes no longer had to go through a state governor to request disaster assistance from the president. In this slide, I've included a picture of the Lumbee tribe making a case before Senate for federal recognition. And these sorts of hearings have been held periodically throughout history, be it for a given tribe to become federally recognized or to reform the process of recognition entirely. A lot of people take issue with the fact that Congress members are outsiders to Indian affairs, but they still have the final say in Native matters. And others are frustrated with the fact that the process can take many, many years. Inefficiency. So in a hearing before Congress, Chairman Brian L. Dorgan stated that both of our tribal witnesses today have been in this process for some 30 years. That is 3 decades. People will be born and people will die in the middle of that process without ever getting answers. And this is what I meant by drudging bureaucracy. It's this sort of sludge and muck that a lot of Native Americans and Alaska Natives are forced to navigate through that really slows down the process of receiving federal funding or assistance or communications with the state and other levels of government. And there are times when this slowing down process means coming to a complete halt. Nonetheless, the process has been much improved by the Sandy Recovery Act. Now the declaration request process is much more efficient and organized, and there's a lot more direct communication and less loopholes for Indian tribes to reach higher levels of government in the United States. We see people who are liaisons for FEMA. We see tribal chiefs and chief executive officers now all collaborating much more efficiently than they used to. On this slide, I've included a map of the 562 federally recognized tribes in 2003, just so that you can get a better picture of how widespread this issue is. FEMA and tribes. Tribes are not treated as a pan-Indian conglomerate, but as individual, deserving, and equal groups. Minority status is considered a legally separate but socially overlapping category from Indian tribal membership or Native American identity. In one UNHCR step-by-step guided plan for its members, they state, consult and involve minority and indigenous refugees in decision-making, programming, and leadership, giving them the means to voice their opinions and participate fully in the design, assessment, monitoring, and evaluation of humanitarian activities and assistance. And this sort of reverence and respect for indigenous knowledge is becoming increasingly standardized as time passes throughout the EM community. Studies have suggested that indigenous knowledge, like working the land and seasonal planting, have helped Native populations globally to cope with the disproportionate burden that climate change and environmental hazards pose to them. One study's results stated that indigenous knowledge systems have enabled the various communities in the area to live in harmony with their environments for generations, and that their traditional knowledge systems are important tools in environmental conservation and natural disaster management. The same study also notes that indigenous rain forecasters predict with reasonable accuracy rainfall for entire seasons, and that local farmers rely on these predictions for their own agricultural needs. And these methods date all the way back to the ancient sutras of India. So indigenous peoples make up 1/3 of the global population, and although each individual indigenous person or group story is entirely unique, there are a few major overarching archetypes that we can identify as concerns for most native and tribal groups. Some of these key issues include language and cultural barriers, like the dissemination of information during emergencies, or the fact that to a great number of these tribes, lands are sacred, and maintaining that sanctity might not look how emergency managers would typically imagine. Poverty in these tribes is also very rampant. 28.3% of single-race American Indians or Alaska Natives lived in poverty in 2014, the highest of any American race group. Access to resources also looks a little bit different with this demographic. TV and internet usage might be different, and how they use the internet, which websites, which communities they're in, which channels they're watching might be different. These tribes rely heavily on federal funding and the use of grants through organizations like the Tribal Emergency Management Association, the National Tribal Emergency Management Council, or the Northwest Tribal Emergency Management Council. But these orgs help with funding in a limited way. Grants are often small when they only go to a few tribes, and whether this funding will be continued on the horizon is never sure. Law enforcement and fire response units get their own jurisdictions within indigenous tribes, and oftentimes they're underfunded or they rely on volunteer membership. What we can learn from this, or what I have concluded is important, is that intersectionality in emergency management is key. The term intersectionality references the critical insight that race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, ability, and age operate not as unitary but mutually exclusive entities, but rather as reciprocally constructing phenomena. Our understanding of the social positionality of indigenous populations within our domestic spheres throughout the international community must be deepened. Tribal rights are human rights, and we must remain critically conscious moving forward with pressing issues like the construction of pipelines across sacred lands in North America. I had a great time exploring this subject, and I've been super invested in the issue ever since I started this project. I hope all of you found this useful, and I'd be glad to answer any other questions to the best of my ability in your class discussion.